Hello, you're about to watch back the recording of a live stream with a conversation between myself and Laura Morgan, Senior Content Designer at The Economist. Here we talk about the value of good content design. We also go all the way to the basics of what is content design, right up to working efficiently with content designers. There were lots of brilliant conversations in the chat, so I hope you enjoy watching back the live stream. Today with me, I have a senior content designer, Laura Morgan, from The Economist, speaking with us today. So, Laura, would you mind telling us where you are based and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm currently based in London, and as you mentioned, so I'm working for The Economist. I actually started this job about 3 weeks ago. So I'm actually really, at the moment, just really getting a good understanding of everything as you're settling into a new job. And as a content designer in this role, I'm working very closely with my colleagues in the product team on optimizing a lot of the user journeys across the whole site.
That sounds excellent. What I'm really interested, and I'm sure a lot of people signing into this call would be, is how you became a content designer. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I guess like a lot of content people, my route into content design was quite meandering. When I was studying at university, it didn't really exist as like a career option. So I studied psychology, and when I graduated, I thought I wanted to do a PhD, but I took some time out, and I ended up in China. So I'd spent some time in China before my degree, and while I was sort of taking this time out to figure out what I wanted to do, I went to China and actually studied Mandarin. And then while I was in China, I wanted to continue exploring my interest in writing. I'd always enjoyed writing, and I was sort of starting to move away from this idea of doing a PhD in psychology. And so while I was in China, I started working with some NGOs and then also magazines and starting to learn to write, or sort of write in a professional way. And then the final role I actually had in China was working with a creative agency, and they were developing this platform that sort of gave me that insight into, how to start producing content in a digital way, and how to start using data to create content, and how to start working with like user insight. When I returned to the UK, I then started working in the charity sector, and one of the reasons I was working in the charity sector was because I wanted to work in an area that I was really passionate about. So when I was working in China, I was actually working for a creative agency, working for Volkswagen. I don't drive, so it was a challenge. So then when I'm sort of working in these roles within the charity sector, I had like different names like digital content editor. I then started to move into roles doing content strategy. And when I was within one role, so working for a charity that was called Breast Cancer Care, it's now merged with Breast Cancer Now. While I was in that role, I actually started working really closely with Sarah Richards, who headed up content design at gov.uk, and she actually was a mentor for me. She actually guided me, taught me one-on-one about content design. She'd been brought in to the charity as a consultant, and I actually sort of learned content design from her. So that's a slightly atypical path. And then from there, I just started continuing to sort of build my skill set. And then moving into roles, I worked for cancer research. So then I was based actually within their marketing team. And I also worked across their technology department. So within that role, I started learning about working with technology teams and working with designers and product owners and developers, which then sort of led me into my most recent role with Alibaba, where I was based in a design team, and then now where I am at The Economist. So it's a very like meandering route, and it is a bit atypical. And I think a lot of content designers, they're not necessarily going to have the same kind of route going to China and working with like someone like Sarah Richards, but ultimately they'll often come from like a slightly different background to what they're doing now.
That's really like interesting just to see like the twists and turns your journey into content design has taken, and kind of the people who mentored you and were inspirational to you along the way.
Yeah.
Well, moving on to my next question, it kind of ties into asking about the topic of content design. Like, could you define to us what content design is, especially because I'm sure you come across examples of good content design, bad content design. What is content design, and could you explain to us what makes good content design?
Yeah, so I guess content design is it's all about allowing people to find the information or do what they need to do as quickly as possible and in the format that they need. It's based on research and insight. And so instead of a company pushing out content that they think they need to, which might be an example of like not good content design, it's more about pulling people in and guiding them with the content they need. It's not necessarily limited to words. So when I am doing content, I'm not just focusing on the way that something is written. I'm also going to be thinking about what's the best content to display. And it might be words, but it could also be other things. It could be images, it could be an infographic, it could be a video, it could be a drop-down list to select from, or a calendar. And like ultimately, good content design is user-focused, and you're also going to balance that with business goals. But ultimately, meeting your user needs is going to help you meet your business goals. So yeah.
Absolutely. And I truly believe, especially just in the circle of UX, that user needs are key in delivering brilliant products. One question that we've had in from the chat is from Y, and they've asked, is content design the same as UX design?
Yeah, so I think this is a really, really interesting question. It's a really good question. There's so many terms being bounded around. So you've got like content strategy, content design, UX writing. I think some people have different opinions on what they are, but from my point of view, I don't see them as three like separate roles. I see them kind of as like maybe three separate stages. So you might start off with your content strategy, which is where you're thinking about your audiences, your business goals, defining that, and also figuring out what kind of content you need to create and what your action plan is for creating and delivering that content to meet your user needs and business goals. Then you start shifting into the design stage, which is where you start thinking about your content templates and structuring the content and what the hierarchy of your messaging is. And then you might shift into the UX writing phase, which is where you're doing the actual writing and you're really focusing on what's happening on the button. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. If you're a UX writer, it doesn't mean that you can't do content design or you can't do content strategy. I think they're just stages in content production, and a UX writer should be using some of the same methodology that you use when you're at the content design stage of user research, and all those best practice methods of creating content when you're doing content design also apply to UX writing and vice versa. So in terms of what was the question again? It was, are UX writing, content design the same?
Yes, it was, is content design the same as UX design?
Or UX design or UX writing?
UX design.
Oh, sorry, I thought you said...
No, that's a good explanation about the writing.
Sorry, I just went off on a tangent then. So whether it's the same as UX design, it's got a good overlap. So UX design, content design, they overlap. There's a sharing of skill set. So a content designer will also take part in doing user research and usability testing, and they might even do sketching. They're going to be doing journey mapping. it's, yeah, so it's not exactly the same. It's designing content, but with words. And that's why designers, content designers and UX designers should try and work together and collaborate to find solutions, because there is a clear overlap in the skill set.
Absolutely. And I think we need those overlaps to have teams that can collaborate better and work together. You talked about stages earlier. I was wondering if you could tell us about the content design process, or where content design fits into the overall design process.
So if I start just sort of running through the content design process, so this is roughly the kind of process I'll follow, and it might differ depending on the kind of project I'm working on, and also some people might have a slightly different method, but like the main process will be, first of all, starting with your discovery. So this is where I'll want to understand like who the audience is, what their needs are, what kind of language they're using. This is a really key one, and it will keep cropping up throughout the process. Thinking also and understanding about what the goals are for this content, what the organization thinks it wants, and also kind of figuring out if that's exactly the same as what it really needs. And then also understanding what we need to be communicating then. And I'll use a range of tools to get this information. So I might be looking at analytics, using SEO tools, heat maps, user research, old A/B tests, forums, depending on the project. But when I've worked in the charity sector, and I was working on a lot of health information, forums were a really good source to kind of understand the kind of information that people were after, and also the language they were using and what their mental state was around particular content and particular point in an experience they might be having. Your next step then will be defining. So once you've got this kind of discovery down, this will help you sort of understand your user needs, and you can start sort of mapping out the journey. And then you can also start defining your KPIs and your metrics, which then come back into play later on. And sort of once I've got into this sort of like defining stage, then depending on who I'm working with, I might start writing user stories. And that's if I'm working with designers or like developers and other people who are used to writing user stories or job stories. And if I'm working with maybe like a marketing team that might not be so used to it, then I might do a more basic workshop that using something called a know, feel, commit. So we'll map out what people need to know, feel, and commit to or do when they see this content. Both result in being able to prioritize the information and the order that it needs to appear in. So it's either as a load of post-it notes on a wall that we map out as a user journey, or it's like on a bit of like a priority matrix. Once that's done, then I'm ready to start creating the content or work with people to start creating that content. So I've got my user stories or my priority matrix, and I've got all this discovery information. I'll usually have a good idea of the content structure. And then I start using best practice methods to create that content. And that might be, breaking the content up into chunks with subheadings, paragraphs, lists. And also if there's other content as well that, isn't written word, it might be images or videos, then I'm going to be working with different people in order to get that content created and make sure that we're getting across the key information we need to. And basically everything is aimed at making it as easy as possible for the user to understand and get the information they need. And then once we've kind of got to like creating the content, then the next step will be getting feedback from colleagues, or maybe doing some testing, particularly if I'm working with a design team. This is very much like a key stage. And then the content goes live. And then the next step will be measuring. And this goes back to your KPIs that you've defined at the start. And this helps determine if your content is successful. And then you might also then do more iterations of the content. And so in terms of where it then fits within the design process, basically, it's just good to be involved as early as possible within the design process. But I would say that we can add value at any stage, but it's best to be involved early when you're still defining the problem.
Absolutely. And kind of touching on defining the problem, a question's been asked in the chat by Ren, who has asked, what do you do when the business isn't clear about their goals for content?
Yeah, and this actually can happen quite a lot. I mean, I used to do, in my previous job, this would often come up in projects, and I would often get the key stakeholders together, and we would do a bit of a workshop. And sometimes that would take the form of perhaps a content strategy statement. And, you know, even if this was just for a simple page, or it might be for like a series of emails, and within that statement, we would brainstorm. Everyone would sort of go away and write on Post-its, or we'd be using a Miro board, and they would be jotting down who the audience is, what the audience needs are, what the business goals are, and the kind of content we want to produce. And there were times when you did this workshop and the people would come back and it was really clear that they hadn't actually considered what the business goals were. And it would either be something that we would need to talk out within the meeting to define, or it may even be that they needed to go away and have a think, because if they weren't sure what their business goals were for the content, my question would be, well, why are we creating it? If like, especially, you know, if it was more on the marketing side and it was a bit of a pushing out of information, then it was a way to get people to really question whether we needed it, especially if the user needs weren't so clear.
Case to just have that definition at the start, knowing what goals you're aiming to achieve.
Yeah.
Something that ties into that is a question that's asked by Tamise. They've asked, how do you measure content efficiency?
In terms of like whether it's achieving what it needs to achieve, or like?
I believe so. Like, how do you know if it's successful? How do you know if it's working well?
So this goes back to early on in your process. Once you're figuring out what your goals are, so if your goals are to increase subscriptions, then you'll start defining your KPIs, which will be, we want to increase subscriptions by 14%, and then your metrics for recording that. When you then create the content, your way of recording how successful it is looking at whether it has actually led to an increase in conversions. There are some things that sometimes content can be tricky to measure when the goal tied to it is a little bit vaguer, when it's around awareness and, you know, increasing traffic. And so that's where then I start to sort of push you know, the stakeholders I'm working with on making sure that they are creating something that needs to be created. You do want to, basically the way that you can tell it's successful is to create some goals for it that you can measure. And sometimes those goals might just be traffic, especially if it's early within your marketing funnel and it's just about getting more eyes on the page, but or the content overall. But yeah, the best way is to figure out what the goals are and how you can measure that. And if it's something that's really hard to measure, then you need to kind of maybe have a think about the content you're creating. So.
Absolutely, because you don't want to create content for the sake of creating content, just like you don't want to design for the sake.
Yeah, and there's, you know, if you think about how much content people come across like every day, like people aren't sort of sat there waiting to have content like put in front of them. So I think now more than ever, people need to be thinking just about creating like what is known as just like smarter content rather than more content. More content is just more content. it's, you know, it's and this is where content strategy comes in, of kind of figuring out what the goals are, why you need to create content, and then create content that is going to help you meet the goals of your business or your organization by meeting your user needs. So.
Absolutely. It's all about the user needs.
Yeah.
Speaking of needs of users, accessibility is a topic that I am super passionate about. And a question that we've had from the chat from George is, what methods have you used to ensure that content design, like the content design you produce, is accessible?
So one of the huge pluses of doing content design is a lot of the best practice methods are actually really relevant to also making content accessible. So, for example, writing in plain English, this is a key thing that you're doing when you're doing content design. You're using vocabulary that's easy to understand. And one of the reasons you do that is because when people are reading online, it's harder for the eyes and harder for the brain to process. So you use plain English, but this is also great for accessibility. It's, you know, I sometimes come across a barrier in terms of when I'm working with stakeholders, they don't want to write in plain English because they see it as like dumbing down. But it's as Sarah Richards, who wrote Content Design, who I mentioned previously, as she mentioned, it's not dumbing down, it's opening up, it's making it a lot more accessible to people. Other methods are like if you're front loading your content, or you're chunking, you're breaking your content into chunks. This makes it a lot easier for people to scan read, but it also makes it a lot easier for screen readers as well. So if someone, if you have people that have visual impairment, they're using screen readers. If you're breaking your content up into chunks and giving headings, it actually means that they can skip through sections. And if you're front loading your content, because the screen reader is like reading out what's on the page, if the information is front loaded with key information, they don't have to listen to lots of irrelevant stuff. They're getting the key information first as well. So that was just a bit of an overall view, but a lot of the content design best practice methods do work for accessibility, and they also work well for the business. So another thing is, if you have alt image text on your images, this is good for people that have a visual impairment, but it's also really good in terms of SEO. So it will help, your ranking a little bit, because it is crawled by search engines. So all of these factors, a lot of these content design best practice methods, they do work for accessibility as well. And also just a little bit vice versa, some of the things that you might do for accessibility are also really good just in general for people that don't have any disabilities. So for example, like if you want to put captions on videos, so for example on YouTube, you can choose whether to put closed captions on or upload your own script. And this is great for people that have hearing impairment, but it's also useful for people who might be watching the video on the tube. And it's also good in terms of search, because your closed caption scripts get crawled by Google, which powers YouTube search engine. So it will help with your video ranking.
Did not know that last point, that your transcript gets crawled and then affects like how it ranks in search.
Yeah, so it can be, especially if you're saying your keywords throughout the video, and then this is within your transcript, then apparently it does have an impact on your ranking, or like YouTube SEO. So.
That is good to know. We have another question. This is in from Tamiz, and they've asked, have you had the chance to co-create features with a product designer in real time? If so, what were your biggest highlights from the experience?
I've not actually had a chance to co-create a feature in real time, actually. So I don't actually have anything to add on that. Yeah, I'm probably going to get that opportunity with in my role at The Economist, but I don't have anything at the moment.
Well, I'm hoping when you do, you're able to share highlights from that experience with us.
Yeah.
What, as well as highlights in our field of design, there are also challenges. What is a challenge that you faced as a content designer?
Yeah, so I think there's a few that I'll cover. One is probably people understanding your like wide skill set. So often I might just be seen as a copywriter, and that can mean that, you know, I'm not being involved as early on as possible, or I'm not getting access to data. Another challenge, which perhaps links into that, is often as a content designer, and this is something I'm usually doing as my role, kind of in the back end as well, and it's something that maybe isn't necessarily so like often seen as content design, but I'm often working a lot on processes, and I have to make change happen. So often when you're looking at like poor content performance, or content that's just not so great, it's usually the result of poor processes. And so you can audit content, you can make recommendations, and this can be where things get stuck. And the next stage is often sorting out that process. And it may be that a team owning the site isn't using data or thinking about user needs, or there's a long, complex sign-off process where someone far removed from the project insists on a change, or the UX writers being involved too late in the journey. And so a process of like adapting or changing is often needed, but changing the way that people work can be hard. So that's often a key challenge, but it's so worth it. But it's often something that needs to be done if you want your content design practice to be sustainable, and to continue improving, and for projects to get a bit easier, and for the content maturity to improve across an organization. So yeah, I would say, yeah, they're going to be the two main challenges of like people understanding the skill set, and then also having to make a lot of change, and you're often doing a lot of educating in the role.
Absolutely. And I think it's important that people do understand better the role that you do, because then they can appreciate the work that you do as well, and get you more involved at key moments through the design process. Another question. Today we've got so many questions coming in the chat, and it's brilliant. Another question we have is from Siddhant, who has asked, who do you collaborate with? So I think this ties into something that we had or wanted to ask you, in terms of, I think they're coming from the perspective of like, who do you work with on your team? And I also wondered if you could answer how teams can best work with content designers.
Yeah. So a lot of the time I'm going to be working with a UX designer, but it's also not uncommon as well to work with developers. So if there's a particular feature that we need to develop, then there's going to be a lot of conversation with a developer to make sure that that can happen. Or there might be, there's always going to be like a lot of back and forth, because it might be that we need to convey some information, but like, can that be conveyed in a particular way? And then it becomes a technical question. So I'm often working with UX designers or product designers, and engineers. There might also be project owners or product owners who are like responsible for the entire product. So at the moment, and in previous roles, these are like the three main people that I'll be working with. In terms of how teams can best work with content designers, just kind of beating that drum of like, involve us early. You might need to rework your process to involve content designers early on, within the as I've mentioned before, like when you're defining your problem, and not at the end as content editors. Sometimes that will happen, and content designers, UX writers, content strategists, we can add value at any stage, but you're going to get a lot more out of us if you've got us right from the start. And it will also be a bit more efficient, because if I'm brought in halfway through a project or at the end, I need just as much context as the designers. So I'm either going to slow things down and say, hang on a minute, I need to get all the information. I need to understand the decision process, like, or the thought process behind this design. I need to understand all the research. And often then there's not time to actually do that. So then the content suffers as a result. So try and bring your content designers in a lot earlier, and work on that process and try different things and try and figure out when the best time is, and it is usually early, to bring them in. When I'm working specifically with designers, I do want to collaborate and like explore solutions together, and that's largely based on like the layout of the content and the flow of the information. And it's best if I work with them early on rather than if I'm just brought in for the writing part, because then I might end up wanting to make some changes that aren't possible, or I'm having to then like shoehorn my copy into like a predefined space. And yeah, I guess like just thinking with content designers, if you're still like exploring like the process and how to bring them in, like just start by inviting them to user testing sessions. They might pick up on things that go missed. So you know, for example, language, it might be that they notice that the users are repeating a particular word, or they're speaking in a particular way, and they might make some notes on that. Or they might just notice that the users are struggling, and it's not because of the design, it actually is more to do with the words or the content in front of them. Yeah, so I think that's overall, going back to what I've said a few times, it's just kind of work early, bring them in early, and collaborate. And yeah, content designers can't really work in isolation. They need to work with other people.
I think these are all fabulous tips that we can take on board to better work with content designers. We've had another question in the chat. Do you have any processes for tracking content consistency through different points of contact in digital products?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, of course. There's a lot of detail to this one. So Tamise has asked, do you have any processes for tracking content consistency throughout different points of contact in digital products?
So I'm not sure what's meant by content consistency. Are we talking tone of voice? Because this is where you're going to have your tone of voice and your style guide, and you're going to be using that to guide the production of content across all your different touch points. And then another way of making sure that this is happening is where your processes and your governance come in. But I'm not sure if that's the question that's being asked, or whether
because I also
on the
saw it
side.
Maybe because I saw it from a different angle of, do you know how designers have a design system which helps them keep their components consistent? Mm-hmm. I don't know if there perhaps is a content design equivalent that could also
so you'll have your style guide. So this is where your style guide and your tone of voice comes into play. So this is where this is going to help you make sure that everything is staying consistent across all your different touch points. Yeah, so that is if that's the question that's being asked, then yeah, this is something that sometimes when you go into an organization, like they might have a style guide, but they might not have something that's applicable for digital. So, or they might have a tone of voice, but it might not necessarily have been sort of broken down into being applicable to use across lots of digital products. So what I've done in the past with like tone of voice is I've like created frameworks based on where someone might be within the user journey, or like what emotion they're feeling. and then what particular tone of voice to apply at that point. And that's based on the brand's tone of voice that's already existing, so it's not anything new. And then it's sort of tying that into what the people's emotional states are. With the, like, if you think about it also from like the design system that you mentioned, I've worked on this. I did work on this a little bit at Alibaba, and I do want to do it more as well in my role with The Economist. And this is working with designers to sort of create like almost like a content design system. So there are particular design modules. So these might be pop-ups or error messages, etc. And just working with the designers on how that looks as a design, and then what the content guidelines are. So if it's a header, within the header, we're always explaining what the problem is. Within the body copy, we're explaining what the solution is. And if there's a button, it's an action that can help somebody resolve that error. So that would be specifically for products. But sort of going back to the original question, if you want to try and maintain consistency across all your different touch points, then it's going to be using a style guide and tone of voice. And what you might find is that you've got your style guide and tone of voice, or you need to define it. And then if you want to like essentially sort of measure the consistency, then you're going to need to do an audit across those channels. And you can give a score based on like how well it matches your tone, how well it meets the tone of voice and style guide. So it might be out of 3. And then when you get to the end, like certain like key messages or touch points will have a score. So that's a bit hard to explain without having a visual, but I guess that's a really roundabout way for answering the question.
That's an excellent answer. Thank you. And we've got one final question, which kind of ties into the last question I had queued up for this evening. Mm-hmm. So Zanjali has asked, what steps did you take to get into content design? Which I think you kind of touched on at the beginning when you explained your journey into the role that you have now. I'd like to also add another question to go alongside that, which is, what advice would you give to someone that wanted to learn more about content design?
Yeah, so as I've mentioned at the start, like I think my journey in was a little bit atypical in getting into content design. I guess it would depend what role you're in right now. But first of all, my advice would be to read this. I think it's displaying back to front, but this is Content Design by Sarah Richards. So this is one of my favorite books. There's loads of books on content. This is like, it's super easy to read. It's really nicely laid out as well. And unlike other like content books, which you tend to like dive into when you're doing, maybe as you're like going through a project and you'll kind of dive in and out. This content design book, I think you can really read it and get a good understanding. And what I would say is kind of read that content design book and see if you can start applying some of those methods in your current role. It really depends, I guess, what you're doing. There are lots of courses as well. So if you're looking to really break into content design, if you're at like an entry level, it's going to be about having a look at, there's some content design courses. There are UX writing courses. There's some like UX writing boot camps. And there's lots and lots of blogs out there, lots of podcasts. So in order to kind of get into content design or UX writing, ideally you need a bit of a portfolio, but it doesn't need to be a huge professional portfolio. You can do some UX writing courses, and they'll often give you assignments, and even the free ones, you can actually build up a bit of a portfolio with that. You might be able to do some volunteer work. I actually did quite a bit of volunteer work early on in my career. So some of the work I did in China was unpaid, and I did some unpaid work in the UK as well. So it might be possible that you can do some volunteer work and with a charity or an organization, and start putting into practice some of the methodology that you've been reading about.
really good. And I love that you had the book to hand to kind of like just sweep you through, like, oh, here it is now that you prepared earlier.
It's basically my Bible. So yeah, it's really handy. It's just very easy and very easy to read, as you would expect from like the content design.
Leading by example, which is great. We have had one last question pop in, and we do have about 5 minutes on the clock, so we can see if we can fit this in. So Manu has asked, so this kind of like breaks down into chunks. Do you agree on having personal KPIs when the content role is related to work with so many different teams? So they've kind of expanded on that by saying, meaning that it wouldn't be able to be separated individually and understand what content did, what design did, what business provided.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of what I've often found is when I'm like creating KPIs is that they tie into the overall business KPIs. Yes, sometimes it can be hard to really pinpoint like, oh, design did this thing, content did this, but this is why you need to collaborate, because it's not often just going to be a single effort. It's not just going to be one particular thing that achieved this result. So that's why I'm always saying that you need to collaborate with engineers and business and marketing and design. But ultimately, like a lot of the KPIs, they should actually be, you shouldn't end up with lots and lots of different KPIs. I have worked places where you've got lots of different teams have their own KPIs and they're all striving for those, rather than actually some more standardized, centralized KPIs that will actually help the business achieve the goals that it needs to. So I would think the best, it's probably good to just not go down the route of trying to prove that one particular team has improved something particularly. There will be certain areas where you can say, like, this is linked to some small content changes that we made or some particular like larger content changes. But when it comes to like a big project, it should be about a collaborative effort and achieving those like as a team. So
100%. It's all about collaboration and just we're all working towards the same goal really, which is to make excellent products that people love to use and make their lives easier.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So we are coming to a close tonight on our talk. Thank you so much for your time tonight, Laura. I mean, I've learned lots of different insights into content design, especially about the process. I think you spoke beautifully, and I hope that everyone in our audience tonight has come away with a little something.
Yeah, I hope so too. It's been really good to talk, and some great questions as well.
Excellent. Thank you all for attending, and have a good evening.